the internet. I think she thought I was shaming her son or something. I don't know. Good morning to all of you. It's lovely to see you again and to be here. I want to thank you for the cards you filled out. There's all kinds of possibilities when you're given cards like that to be succinct and to not really get with it. And I should have realized, because it took a bit of a time yesterday, that you really were doing it. But I lay there in bed last night and read with the deepest pleasure, is not quite the right word, the cards that, I'm in that spot again, the cards that you filled out. Because of the candor of some of them and the openness. I was also delighted to know there are 2 or 3 vestries here in toto, sort of, and regarding this as vestry retreat. May it indeed be worth your time and some help. Having said that, I also perceived, and I appreciated the candor, several of you expressed anxiety, saying that indeed what was happening was not fun, that you didn't like it, and that 2 or 3 of you even confessed to being traditionalists. Well, you go. You go, guys. That's great. I am going to upset you even more. And there's nothing I can do about that, okay? All I'm asking of you is that if you will sit tight, your time is coming, but it will be after lunch. So you have to pledge now to stick with me and come back after lunch, and we will redeem your part of the church, all right? But we're about to really have fun with it, and there's nothing I can do. Yesterday, I tried to build a bit of a timeline for what was going on, and of course, we never got beyond mid-century of the 20th century. I'm sorry, and we're going to have to condense the second half to some extent. But I can't condense all of it, 2 or 3 things. Certainly cognitive science and the drug age, the coming of Buddhism into the culture or of Eastern spirituality, those things matter enormously. There are a couple of other things maybe that matter even more. First of all, let me say that Vietnam had a huge impact on American religion. I thought we shouldn't have been fighting in the first place. And it was the end of the Pax Americana, or the Golden Age, whatever you want to call it. Most historians speak of the years between the Second World War and Vietnam as the Pax Americana, which is a direct reference, of course, to the Pax Roma of ancient Rome. That period, that Golden Age of Rome, when it was at the peak of its own strength and of its presence in the world, and things went downhill from then on. We had a brief beep, if you will, when we got Mr. Kennedy, and we once more felt proud. But there was a time in there when the Pax Americana was great, and then we hit Vietnam. But it is also, unfortunately, another blow to clericism. That is to say, a number of our pastors across the nation also supported the Vietnamese War. And were a bit of warmongers. And it came to be a matter of great concern and has affected religion ever since. That having been said, the thing that probably happened next that was most dramatic is twofold. The Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement, not because of the reasons you think, not because of the integration of the races, but because in that course of that integration, we got our first real whiff in the dominant white Caucasian culture of what it meant to worship God, to have a religious life that didn't have preachers and churches that were our kind of preachers and churches, and that did allow the congregation to jazz a little bit. And Micah Row Your Boat became the theme song for a while of the last part of the century, because you could do it this way. And so we got a first introduction, if you will, to American Christians who had a spirituality that was indigenous to them. This is going to be really hard. That was indigenous, that they could feel, that was in their bodies. And it's aggravated by that thing called the Sony Walkman. Now, the Sony Walkman comes just shortly after the Civil Rights Movement really gets started. And all of a sudden, we see these kids going down the street like this, you know, with things in their ears, and they are purely in their own world, and if you don't watch out, they'll walk into you because they're not looking at you. They're inside their skulls, but they're jazzing it up. It's aggravated, of course, by the iPod, to say the least, because if you sit on a plane now, you know that the whole thing could probably fall in the ocean, and half of the people in the fuselage wouldn't even know it because they're so plugged in, until they hit the water, it would be their first. Why does that matter? Why does it matter to religion? It matters simply because of this one thing. It is music that is participatory instead of performance. The Reformation was hierarchical, it was intellectual, and it was highly individual. The Protestantism that comes out of it, and even the Anglicanism that is informed and shaped to some extent by it, are all of those things. Hierarchical, intellectual, very individual. And part of that means that one of the things the Reformation gave us is pews, screwed down and in a row. They're screwed down and in a row so you can look up at the preacher. Because we all know that 500 years ago, you probably were illiterate, or you came from illiterate parents. And if you were going to have sola scriptura as your base of authority, and if you were going to have the priesthood of all believers, you had to come every Sunday morning, not so much to worship as to be instructed by the one guy who could read. And therefore, lest you doze off, or lest you go out and chase a dog, or do something like that, or have a little conversation over in the corner, which was what the medieval cathedral was, we got the screwed down pews, and we got the elevated pulpit, and we got the fact that anywhere you looked, ultimately you had to look up at that man as he droned on and told you what you needed to know. That's hierarchy. We got concomitant with it the music that is played by the organ, which is up there beside the man who's droning on, And up until the Walkman comes along, even with all due respect to the old Victrola, and Caruso singing on those old 78s, those of you who can remember that, the truth of the thing was the only place you could really hear music up until the last century, music of any real sort, was in church. Now, if you were in a little village church or something, then Miss Susie was playing the piano. And she wasn't all that good, but at least she had a piano, and you could go hear her. If you were in a big city or if you were near a cathedral, you had that organ, and you had that accomplished organist, and you could go hear good music, and it was performed. The sermon was performed. Everything was performed. Once you get the combination of the civil rights movement and the introduction to a form of indigenous American spirituality and religion that is not necessarily performed, that is participatory, and once you get the beginning of the Sony Walkman, you get a shift in what people want. What they actually begin to want is the ability to feel it, the ability to shake with it a little bit. And a big part of what's going on right now in emergence Christianity is, and never underestimate it, is a strong desire to feel in the body what the faith is. Whatever other characteristic you may lay at the door of emergence Christianity, it is deeply incarnational. And it does not mean that word in the same way theologians usually mean it. It's not talking about God in human form in terms of Jesus Christ. It's talking God in my human form. I want to feel it. And you cannot, with all due respect to Bach, he is still Bach. And I will go to a concert one night a year and hear the old boy just for old time's sake, But don't do it to me on Sunday morning. Or please, it would be much better if we didn't even do Sunday morning, but we have to do Sunday morning. Then don't do that. Now, this is heresy. You try saying to your vestry, we are going to unscrew the pews. We'll just stop there. That's the showstopper. We're going to unscrew the pews. We're going to take that pulpit down. We're going to sit in loose chairs or in sofas or easy chairs or whatever, and we're going to face each other, and whoever is doing the talking is going to be sitting right down here in the chair with us. And after about 10 minutes of listening to X drone on, whoever X is, we're going to then open up a conversation, whether we're twittering or not in terms of electronics. We're going to twitter with each other, and we're going to decide whether we think what got said really plays in Poughkeepsie. Was that good exegesis? Was that honest? Because the other thing about emergence Christianity is it's deeply relational. And when you sit like that, you're not having any relationship much with the folks next to you because you're all looking at me. And it doesn't much matter where I go in this room to stand. You're going to end up still having to look at me in some way that doesn't allow you any kind of horizontal intimacy. And so emergence Christianity is deeply relationship. Interrelation. It wants that. The other thing it says is, you've got this fella or gal coming down in all those fancy dresses and robes, and every once in a while one of them has a really big gold ring, or every once in a while they wear purple, or they have these funny hats. Is that authentic? What does that mean? Does that do anything for God other than give him a giant belly laugh? It's a good question. It's a good question. Is it authentic? Is it real? And so what we get out of the last part of the last century is those three questions. Is it authentic? Is it relational? Is it incarnational? And they hit immediately our space. They hit everything we do physically about the space in which we worship. Now, one of the things I'm going to say to you, and we'll say several times as a matter of fact, if you're interested in helping an emergence congregation to come up out of your situation, if you're interested in having what Archbishop Rowan Williams calls a mixed economy church or congregation, in which there is an alternative worship or an emergence component, as well as the traditional one, you're never going to put them in the same physical space. An emergence congregation cannot meet in this space. It won't happen. Now, you can come close to doing something alternatively, but you'd have to jazz it up, and you really have to have some dancing in the aisles. It's because there's not that thing. It's not authentic. It doesn't belong to our time. It's hierarchical, and we aren't. It's because it's very intellectual. You are here frantically taking notes, every one of you. I am really glad. I thank you. I hope Gary Hall sees you doing it because it sort of justifies his bringing me here. But you're doing it. You see? You're doing it. You're not holding hands with each other. You're not chattering with each other. You're not nudging each other. You're not getting up and going back and getting a cup of coffee and coming back. You're being intellectual. Be very careful about that. Be very careful about that. And you're deeply individual. One of the things that Elizabeth told me this morning when I came in that was sort of sad was, we're doing prayers, right? We're doing worship services each time as we begin an intercession together. And we're doing them out of what you and I would recognize as a missalette. It's lifted out of a breviary, right? And we're doing it like this because that's the way you do it if you come up out of 500 years of Reformation study. Our intention was for the closing prayers at 3:30 this afternoon to put the drop-down screen, don't die, those of you who are traditional, to put the drop-down screen here and put the words of the 3:30 service up on the screen. Why? So we could offend half of you? No. So we could make the point. And the point for the emergence, the reason for the drop-down screen is not to be cool. The reason is that if you're honest, when you're looking at a breviary or a missalette like this, you are deeply into yourself. You enclose yourself even more. When all of us turn and look at the screen and get the prayer off of that, we become far less individual. We are far more centralized. It lifts us up out of the private experience into a shared experience. That's what the screen is about. I used to say if I had one more priest come up to me after a meeting and say, can you show me how to do one of those emergence congregations? We've already got the drop-down screen. I was going to die, because it clearly doesn't understand the reason for the screen. It's not to save money on hymnals. It's a psychological shift in where you're focused. So the Sony Walkman, in dead seriousness, the Sony Walkman, in conjunction with the civil rights movement and the beginning of the integration of worship experiences amongst the races, is of huge importance, the combination of those. In terms of what your internet is the basis of the Great Emergence in every way. It's the basis of emergence Christianity. In the same way that one can say that the printing press was the fundamental basis for Protestantism, or the thing that was the great enabler, maybe that's what I mean, The net has enabled it. The net has also enabled great emergence as a social construct. It is our connectedness that makes the great emergence possible. It is certainly our connectedness that makes possible emergence Christianity. Now, having said all of that, I want to, if you will permit me, to just skip the rest. There are about 44, I think I counted it one time, 44 different things that happened in the peri-emergence that got us where we are. And obviously, if we spend 44 of them, we're not going to get where we have to get. And so, with your permission, is it all right to close? Have you got this, those of you who want it? Okay. I want to not do any more with the peri-emergence and get to who we are and to some extent what we look like and why. Pannenberg, Walter Pannenberg is a theologian known to many of you, German, obviously. He is credited with being the original source for what I am about to do. In this country, Wade Clark Roof, who is also, I hope, known to many of you, invented the generation of seekers term, University of California, now emeritus, is the one who began to deal with this scholarship and to put it out for general consumption. So whether you attribute it to Dr. Roof or whether you give it to Walter Pannenberg doesn't matter, but certainly what I'm about to do is not of my own invention. All of us who do this have played with it a little bit, so I think it picks up some idiosyncratic parts to it, but basically it is common scholarship. What Pannenberg said, and again I remind you and say for the sake of those who were not there yesterday, we are now limiting our remarks to pretty largely, to North American Christianity. This same thing could be said of other areas and also of Judaism, but please hear what I'm saying in terms of Christianity in this country right now. What Pannenberg said, and he said it sometime in the 60s originally, probably about 62 or 3 was when he first said it, was that by 2000, Christianity in North America, and if he was saying, of course, in Europe also, but in Latin Christianity was what he was saying. Christianity in Latin Christianity, North American Christianity, would be fairly equally divided into 4 distinct groups. The first of which, he said, was liturgical Christians, by which at that time he meant us and Roman Catholics and some confused Lutherans probably, but no Orthodox. There weren't enough Orthodox for him in this country to see them. The next third quarter of was social justice Christians. Now, he called them main line. I don't use that term, and it's not used by many people who are doing this anymore, because it's a bit of a confusion. The biggest part of the confusion is that Anglicanism belongs over here, and sometimes when you say mainline, Episcopal Church shows up over here, and that's a major confusion that most of us in this room cannot afford. I have to say again, Anglicanism is not a denomination. It is a division of Christianity. Church looks like a denomination, walks like one, talks like one, quacks like one, but it is not a duck. It really is part of the Anglican tradition, and that's a distinct form of Christianity. So social justice means primarily, if you want to give it denominational names, Methodist, Presbyterians. The difference here, if it helps any, the difference here is at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, build a Habitat for Humanities, or you can take the Mass. The liturgicals are going to go take the Mass. The Methodists and Presbyterians are going to go build a Habitat for Humanity. And it's the old faith and works dichotomy. You know, it's nothing new here in any way. Down here, conservatives, this quadrant has had every kind of name thrown at it. If it helps denominationally, and it's such a simplistic reduction, but even at one point, Southern Baptists were put down here as if they occupied the whole thing. This is evangelicals. This has also been called things ugly like theocrats. Every one of those terms bears some freight that I find unfortunate, and so I find myself coming back to the conservative thing. That too is a bit of a confusion. But if you can think of it as those who are were most intimately involved with Jesus as opposed to the Christ, if that helps, rhetorically, it's a rhetorical distinction. These people would probably have said Jesus 100 years ago. We would have said the Christ or Christ up here in this corner. And that, too, is a ridiculous kind of simplicity. Over here, what's now called the renewalist, which is a fancy word, thank God, for what we used to call charismatics and Pentecostals. They've always shared this quadrant. I have never, you can tell me now, and I won't know an hour from now, the difference between a Pentecostal and a charismatic. But I do know if you want to really anger a charismatic, you put him or her in the same box on a chart with a Pentecostal. It really ticks them off big time. And in general, the other thing happens too. And it was so difficult in the academic world that 2 years ago, the Pew Foundation went through and did a major study of American religion and invented the word renewalist and said to everybody, we're going to put them together in a common label and get rid of the animus between them. Nobody, I think, can even remember what the study was, but every one of us sighs with relief. We've got a word now so that it's not freighted with anger. The renewalist comes straight up out of the Azusa Street experience and the spread of it. Charismatics may not like that, but it's true. These folk are deeply important. As I said yesterday and will say again, this is in many ways the X factor. This is the new thing in Christianity. Emergence Christianity is informed hugely by the presence of this quadrant that wasn't even there when the Reformation came along. This is the new part of the picture. Now, what Pannenberg said was, as we become more and more loosed from our natal traditions, that is to say, as we become more urban, as women become more and more empowered, Susie doesn't have to finish high school and get married and stay home and live next door to Grandma and raise 3 more little Susies. That's not true. She now goes to work. She now goes to college. She goes to work somewhere in the city, and she remembers to call Mama on her birthday. It's and a week before her own, just so Mama won't forget that it would be nice to have a check. But as we become more and more loosed from those, as the home ceases to be the purveyor of biblical literacy, as we lose biblical literacy, as we become more and more aware of other religions and become more and more unclear of exactly what it is that Christianity is different from and why we should be exclusive about the whole thing. As all of that begins to happen, and as we come to live in apartment houses and to work in factories, all of us, and live in and work in cubicles together in office buildings, as we cease to have independent homes and have condos and live in units, as all of that happens, what was going to happen, said Pannenberg, and he was exactly right, what's going to happen is that right here, which is where the energy is, because evangelicalism has been enormously energetic since the Second Great Awakening. Right here, the people who are evangelical, who are now cut loose to some extent. Let's say Susie. I hate to take Susie, but let's take Susie. I'm going to abuse her. I might as well. Susie's away from home for the first time. She's got herself a brand new college degree. She's living in a cute little condo in the city. She's proud as she can be. She has no furniture, but she's happy. And she's working in an office, and for the first time making friends that aren't from her town. This is 80% of America, by the way, that I am describing here. A little over 80%. For the first time, she's working, and she's got her own place, and it's just great. And she's beginning to make friends that aren't friends from childhood. And one of those friends happens to be a Pentecostal. Oh, my goodness. Well, it's Susie's first opportunity to know a Pentecostal. And they begin to have coffee, and they begin to talk to each other. And the first thing you know, they're going to a movie together, or they're going to a concert together. And in the course of things, Susie discovers that her Pentecostal friend really thinks she can heal things with prayer. What a concept. Susie is a Baptist, and you do a lot of praying, but you don't really expect anything to happen. Surely you don't connect the two. It's a matter of focusing yourself for whatever God's going to do, as opposed to the other way around. And it gets to be really interesting. It gets to be especially interesting when Susie's Pentecostal friend can cure a head cold. And even more interesting when Susie's computer goes down and her friend comes in and lays hands on it and the thing starts working again. And that becomes really confusing, and that's a good Pentecostal story. You can heal more things than just folks. And so they begin to talk, and what they're doing is God talk. It's not theology, it's God talk. They're just talking about, why does that happen? Do you really pray? Do you think God hears you in that way? You know, I'm not sure. And it's right in up there with which wine shall we have for supper tonight? And you want to go to a movie, and do you really think God does that? It's not a set-aside time to do theology. It's just part of the conversation. It's part of how we live. And in the course of that, they meet another little girl. I seem to be on girls. That's all right. They meet a little girl over here who does this neat thing on Christmas Eve. It's the only time she does it. But she, on Christmas Eve, goes down to the nearest Episcopal church, and she does this incredible thing. There is this beautiful service. And who knew that was part? We don't do that in the Baptist church. Oh, my goodness, no. Had no idea. And the first thing they know, not only is it Christmas Eve, but there's a thing called evensong every once in a while, and it's maybe at the Roman Catholic Church. Or you can go look at all those beautiful things in the Orthodox Church, and there's that icon and the iconostasis, and isn't that fascinating? And all of a sudden, there are colors, and there's smells, and there's bells, and there's a kind of sex appeal to this part of Christianity. I don't want to be an Episcopalian. Wouldn't do it for anything. I don't want to be a Roman Catholic. Wouldn't do it. Don't want to be Orthodox. But I sure would like to come every once in a while and just look at what you're doing, you know? And I wouldn't mind borrowing your Book of Common Prayer, if you don't mind, since there's no copyright on it. I'd be pleased to lift part of it and maybe even circulate it with some friends, you know? And that's kind of interesting. And could you tell me about the liturgical year? What does the liturgical year mean? I'm going to meet next month with Church Publishing, which is our church-owned publishing house. We can't prove it, but I'm very, very sure that the majority of our literature as Anglicans, as Episcopalians, dealing with the liturgical year and the ancient disciplines of the faith are going to emergent Christians and emergent cohorts. And our Book of Common Prayer is in almost every gathering, or at least pieces and parts of it. That's why, one of the reasons it's important for us in the rest of this discussion to remember Anglicanism is a tradition. It is a way of being Christian, and we are its presentation. It is important to remember that Roman Catholicism, still for the emergent Christian, has a certain cachet. They're not quite sure what it is, but it's a little too churchy. Protestantism is not exactly what they're rebelling against. That's too aggressive. But it sure is where they came from and ain't going to go back to. Orthodoxy is not accessible enough. It does have those cool icons, but it's very hard to get beyond that unless you're trained in it. And the last man standing, the last man of the four tributaries is Anglicanism. And the empathy, the sympathy, the resonance between Anglicanism and emergence Christianity is startling. About 22 or 23 months ago, when I began to have to admit to myself that as an Anglican, I was not looking chauvinistically, that I was looking realistically at what was going on, it was amazing to me. I think I had defended myself from that truth, thinking that I was just seeing the world I was used to looking at. That's not true. That is not true. And one of the, don't ever forget, Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, has been here for, England is ahead of us. Europe and the UK and its provinces, or its former colonial, secularized or went into the emergence about 25 or 30 years before we did in this country. So as a result, they're much farther along. But be aware that Bishop Catherine is very, very aware of what's happening and of the resonance between Anglicanism and emergence Christianity. Remember, and I think I said it to you yesterday, Brian McLaurin is the leader, he's the guru, he's the Martin Luther of emergence Christianity. And who was it who was the only non-Anglican asked to address Lambeth last summer? Brian McLaurin. Brian McLaurin. So that, all of which is to say, I don't want to lay a burden on you greater than that of being a parish vestry in a parish that seems to not have as many people on Sunday morning as you wish, but I'm going to lay it on you anyway. As Anglicans and as Anglican leaders and as Anglican ordained folk, there is a mission field here that we can't even begin to fathom. Because of that resonance. And so it is that Susie and her two friends, because they are young and because they are moral, and if the Emergence is anything, it is incredibly moral. It is so sick of Hugh Hefner and his fallout, and the excesses of consumerism and patent greed, that it almost breaks its back being moral. Because they are moral and because they are concerned, they're going to go build this Habitat for Humanity. And as they build it, they're going to pick up some folk who are of that persuasion. And what's going to happen, and this is simplistic, but what's going to happen is, like this, more and more, we don't belong to any quadrant, though we clearly came out of one. We don't belong to a quadrant. We belong to each other. We belong to the fact that by now we have something that looks a lot like a cell church, or like a house church, or like a beer and Bible at the local pub, or like just, supper on Tuesday evenings to talk. This becomes our church. This becomes the place we inform each other in the faith. And the first thing you know, we discover that there is a cell or a house church or something over across town, or that the beer and Bible session has gotten too big and they've broken into two and gone to two different pubs, and it's possible to go to one of them also, as well as to go to your... And then before long, you discover sometimes 250, 300 of these groups of Christians who are talking God. They are talking God in the most serious kind of way. Are they theologically trained? No, they're not. And that is Emergence wonderful? No, Emergence just is. This is not a value judgment. I'm not an Emergent. I'm a reporter here. I don't ask you to make... You can not like the fact that the sun comes up every morning before you are ready to get up and it annoys you. But the sun's still going to come up, okay? You can find this less than attractive, but it's still going to happen. So, get your value judgment business out of the conversation here and look at what's happening. And it is happening. And Emergence has problems. It just has them. And one of the problems is that whoever is gathered at Beer and Bible is not necessarily trained in theology, but they are trained by the net, And the net is as good or as bad as the site you're on. And they laugh and call themselves Wiki Church. And Wiki Church, Wiki Church is absolutely appropriate. And what they mean, those of you who know Wikipedia know what I mean, but what they mean is that ultimately if they talk enough and ask each other enough questions, they're going to, as a group, as an open source, self-organizing thing, they're going to arrive at the truth. One of the things I said to Seabury-Western's board last week when I was so pleased to be with them is, we don't need another seminary in the Episcopal Church that trains clergy. What we need is a seminary of the people. What we need is the People's Seminary, a place where Susie can come and look up something and get something out of the normal tradition, something theologically vetted in a way, to take back to Beer and Bible, to take back to the pub, whatever. So that's what happens. So we've got a city with 250, 300 of these things, and eventually they begin to realize that we have, let's take Austin, Texas. I don't know why, but Austin, Texas. We have a cohort. That is to say, we have this gathering of all of these people, all of whom are doing more or less the same sort of thing, all of them passionate in their Christianity. And so wouldn't it be cool if, maybe once every 6 months or so, folk would come from each of those groups and kind of gather. Now, a self-organizing anthill doesn't have a queen ant. That's true. I said that yesterday. But we're beginning to look a lot like something that smacks of organization, right? I mean, that's not a diocese. God forbid it should be a diocese. That's not a diocese, but that's a form of physically getting together, whatever you want to call it. Will Emergence eventually organize? Of course it will. Of course it will. Human things just organize eventually. Will it organize with some hierarchy? Probably not. It probably is going to probably organize horizontally. It's not going to do it this way, but it will be there. And there will be some leader who will convene this meeting, but you'll probably never really know who he or she is, because it will be an electronically issued invitation, and it won't be an invitation, because that assumes there's a hierarchy. It'll just be an announcement. We're going to gather under the old oak tree. You want to come? And who comes, comes. And that's it. And so what we get is this kind of, right here, swirling around and around and around and around and around until it picks up huge momentum. And that's where we are right now. And it comes up sort of like a water funnel, if you will, up out of the center of where all of these four meet. And it spews out like this. And Pannenberg said, accurately, I believe, that before it's over, 50% of American Christians will be in this center. The energy always goes this way, always with a few exceptions, of course, naturally. That is to say, it comes out of evangelical, or it comes out of the Jesus quadrant. It comes out. Emergence Christianity is deeply Jesus-centered. It is deeply Jesus-centric. And it comes up out of the evangelical. You're not going to get far talking about Christ too much, unless you can get down and dirty and talk about Jesus, in an evangelical way. I find that comfortable because I really am an evangelical Episcopalian, which is not an oxymoron looking for a place to park. It really can happen. And so I find it enormously comfortable to see it. But I was reared a Presbyterian. I got over it, but I was reared one. And so Jesus is fairly comfortable for me. But it comes up out of this. This is where the energy is, or was the initial. And then it has massive energy, which is the Pentecostal movement, which is the active engagement of the Spirit. The Spirit of God actually curing coals, actually changing history, actually being present, actually being visibly present in glossolalia and xenolalia. And then it meets us with our colorfulness, and then it meets humanity with its ability to love. And so it becomes all of this. Now, it goes that way, except every once in a while, there will be somebody who will come up out of this corner and go the wrong way. And they look as if it's an aberration. The one you probably know best is Jim Wallace from Sojourners. And the reason he looks different or odd or emergent but not quite is he's going in the wrong direction, which is what I tell him. He's just going against the centrifugal force. He went backwards but got the same place. And there are other groups. Up here is not included, just in case you get to wondering, the Mormon Church. Most scholars now regard Mormon Christianity as a different Abrahamic religion. It's not Christianity at all. Mormonism is the fourth of the Abrahamic faiths. For the same reason that Christianity cannot be regarded as the second of the Jewish faiths. The presence probably of a distinct set of scriptures is as much as anything a defining distinction. Also, if you're curious, the Quakers are not here, but I'm going to put them there. That is to say that the Quakers belong right there. The Quakers are deeply into social justice, and they are obviously deeply into conservative approach to religion. And it was they whose theologians began to be the first of the enablers, the theological enablers of emergence Christianity, originally came out of Quaker tradition. Those of you know Parker Palmer, Richard Foster, these were the first, Brett Bill, to some extent Dallas Willard, although, and specifically John Wimber. John Wimber, who went on to revive, I suppose, or resuscitate and grow up the Vineyard Association, was trained as a Quaker, and it is Quaker theology that he brings to the discussion, so that the theology that allows this thing to happen comes out originally of a Quaker script. Now, what Pannenberg said was, as this thing happens, as about 50% of North American Christians begin to move in this direction, there's going to be folk up here in the corner. In each corner, and he said 9 to 13%, or somebody said 9 to 13%, It looks to me like more accurately we're going to end up with 7 probably to 10%. In each of these corners, there's going to be those folk who absolutely say, no, it is not going to happen. This is the work of the devil. This must not be allowed. And I have a divine vocation. I have a calling. My soul, in converse with my God, concludes that whatever else I do with my life, I have got to stop this thing. This thing attacks Scripture. The very presence of this thing, by definition, throws down sola scriptura. It throws it out. It questions, if you understand sola scriptura to be absolute inerrancy, if you think sola scriptura is the Protestant definition of absolute inerrancy, then you're going to be up here in these corners. And one of the things that troubles me, up here we call this Bob Duncan, if that helps, or we call it Peter Akinola in our corner, if that helps, or we call it Jack Schofield. And one of the things that troubles me most at a private level about our communion right now, and it's happening here, over here it's the Presbyterian Church in America, or the Reformed Presbyterian Church, or the Missouri Synod of Lutheran. It's got its names in part of the Southern Baptist Convention is moving down here. Not all of it is. So it's in all the corners. There's even one over here in Assemblies of God, dropping back. But one of the things that troubles me, we've got the best press. Unfortunately, Episcopalians and Anglicanisms just attract the press. I don't know what we do. Maybe we look better. I don't know. Or we're more literate and we can have a sharper line. I don't know. But we've sure gotten the coverage out of this thing, whether we wanted it or not. And one of the things that distresses me to death is our failure to understand how much pain is involved in getting up here. Our failure to respect it. Much as Akinola annoys me, of course he annoys me. I mean, he's living, come on, in levirate marriage and in polygamous society, and he's worried about gay. It makes no sense, except that it's sola scriptura that he's up. The Bible admits of polygamous marriages. It admits of levirate marriages if you go far enough back in the Old Testament. So there's no violation. If everything hangs on sola scriptura, if everything hangs on its foundationalism, on its inerrancy, then this explains why he's there. That's what he's doing. If you believe that sola scriptura is all we've got, if everything hangs on sola scriptura, and somebody comes along and says, no, you have to interpret this thing in terms of the whole, or you have to interpret it in terms of the narrative and not the particular verse, then what's threatened is everything you've given your life to, and your father gave his life to, and your mother gave her life to, and your grandparents gave their life to. Every understanding of what life is about for the devout practicing Christian, and most of the people up here are devout practicing, or down here, are devout practicing Christians. They are not your casual folk who just happen to go to church every once in a while. They are absolutely involved. There is passion. And what they are defending is their way of being, their family's way of being. And it is extremely painful. Mel Gibson belongs up here in this corner, and that's got to be the worst movie I ever saw. It's the only movie I ever left. And I left because, not that I didn't approve of it, I couldn't bear it. I thought, any human being would have passed out long before that movie was over from the excruciating torture. It was just violence after violence against our Lord. And I was so offended because it denies his humanness. If he were totally human, he'd have been conked out and gone long before that movie was anywhere near end. I left furious, but at the same time very aware that for Gibson, who is old church Catholic, is his denomination and belongs up here, the pain that led to that kind of that thing was made on private money. He made that out of his own pocket. out of the sense that it really mattered. Everything he had stood for was down the tubes if this thing happens. Well, you know, sorry about that. This thing is going to happen anyway. How you react to it is up to you. So anyway, what we've got, well, let me do one thing right quickly. If I have my red, I do. I should have been using the red, just because it probably matters. These, lest we misunderstand, these lines are not absolutely impenetrable. These lines are semi-permeable, all right? If you remember Dorothy Day, who belongs right here, but boy, did she bulge out over into that, right? That's exactly where she was. And, John Wesley died in his rabbit, let's face it. And if you watch what's happening right now between us and Methodism, sometime in the next 150 years, he's going to be home again. It's true. And so he never lost the liturgy, never lost his interest in it. Social justice Christians can be enormously conservative. And conservatives are as interested in soup kitchens and Habitats for Humanity and food pantries as anybody else. And you get the message. There's nobody more conservative than the Assemblies of God, which is the second largest congregation down here in the renewalist column quadrant. And Pentecostalists are enormously conservative. So what you've got really is a Boeing. When my children were little, they used to say, it really makes a difference which syllable you put the emphasis on. And they were absolutely right. This is a matter of the emphasis here is on the liturgy for these people, but it doesn't mean they don't participate to some extent in these other values. As this swirling began, like this, it makes this configuration. The rose was the flower of the Reformation. Wearing a rose was how you indicated to others that you were indeed a reformer and a Protestant. This is called the new rose. And the leaves really are supposed to be green. The quadrants down here, the corners, really are supposed. When you hear people talk about the new rose, this is the new rose. This is what they're talking about. Is the fact that we signal each other by saying, I belong to part of the pilgrim community or the New Rose. And that's what they're doing, just kind of an FYI. All right, what happens, can't make it go. Well, if you will allow me to draw this one more time and not quite the same way, but if you can assume that it's here and I'm doing the same thing. So we have this swirl right here coming out of the middle like this. But the truth of it is that our liturgicals and our social justice spoke, and our renewalists spoke, and our conservative folk, whoever they are. There's a real difference. There's a reason that Pannenberg put these two above the center axis and these two below it. And the reason is that when push comes to shove, if you get right down to it, the folk up here really are concerned with orthopraxy. And the folk down here really are concerned with orthodoxy. Now, ortho is a really fine long product. It is also, as most of you know, the Greek word for right, for correct. Orthodoxy means correct belief. Orthopraxy means correct practice. And the tension between these is that tension. That is to say, I went to an undergraduate school, Southern Baptist undergraduate school, and had a delightful experience and made many Southern Baptist friends. And I used to say to them, I don't understand the drinking thing, because they knew it was wrong to drink. And my favorite quip as an undergraduate was, I don't get that. We follow a man who changed water into wine because he didn't have time to go to the liquor store. So what's the problem here? For which they had no answer. But nonetheless, they retain the notion that it's wrong to drink. Fine, okay. My best friend, who is now deceased from college, lived a good deal away from us. And I would drive every once in a while, about once a year, to go visit her. And every time I got ready to go visit, about 36 hours before I got ready to go, I would get the phone call. And the phone call was, don't forget to bring communion. Okay. And I wouldn't. And I would get there, and we would commune 3 and 4 times some afternoons, as a matter of fact. But you see, it was all right. She knew it was wrong. As long as she believed it was wrong, and she really wasn't sinning because it was on my check card. I'm an Episcopalian, and we all drink, of course, you know. Where 3 or 4 of us are gathered together, there'll always be a fifth, you know, kind of thing. And so it was all right, as long as she knew it was wrong, as long as she believed it was wrong. Now, we can laugh about that because we're up here. And so, you know, we can drink and do all those good things. You can really be a very fine Episcopalian and not be able to say whether you believe the virgin birth happened or not. You know? I mean, it's okay. You believe it? You don't? Hey, let's go have coffee. You know, it really is not that serious. But let me tell you, honestly, if by chance you're on sacristy duty or altar guild duty and you happen to wash the chalice out in the sink instead of the piscina, God help you. You have just screwed with your soul. You washed the Son of God down into the sewer. What war are you thinking of? You know, it's true, you know. And so it's as ridiculous as this is. Absolutely, right? And I, by the way, am very careful that it's in the piscina. I even empty my limb kit and wash it very carefully and pour it outside. And my husband just keeps shaking his head and saying, when are you going to get over that? Well, I'm probably not, you know. And he also keeps saying, you let the dog out every time you do that, and then I have to go get her because I stand it. But whatever. That's orthopraxy, gone pathologic, but it's there. Sitting here in the center, both our worlds look really crazy. To an emergence Christian, what? It makes no sense at either end. So what they have got is, they call it orthonomy, which I can't spell, orthonomy. Now, ortho still means right or correct or whatever. Honomos, as most of you know, is the Greek word for the law, for the rightness of God, for how God likes it. And so they say over here on this side of the divide, we're going to not fool with what you believe or with what you practice or how you behave. We're going to fool with orthonomy, the music of the spheres. I don't remember whether I told you yesterday or not, but if I did, please forgive me. I'm going to tell you again. The best example, because I've told this story so many times that I was sitting, so help me, in the Washington Cathedral in a worship service, and Sam Lloyd, dean of the cathedral, got up and told my story and never even knew it was mine. And I almost rose up from the pew and said, whoa, wait. But anyway, it's this good a story. And I laughed. I laughed at it later. I didn't care a bit about it. It's such a good story for demonstrating this. And the story is that several years ago, I was in St. Philip's Cathedral in Atlanta talking to adults. It was a supper meeting, and we were doing a wide-ranging conversation about a lot of things. And the virgin birth just keeps popping up, whether you like it or not. It just does. And because somehow it's become sort of the sine qua non for talking about sola scriptura in many ways. And historicity. So it came up, and I talked and batted it around and whatever. And the EYC was serving the supper, and when supper was over, they were cleaning the dishes like this, and there was this kid, 16, 17 years old, no more than that, who was scraping the dishes, and as we talked more about the virgin birth, he got slower and slower until he almost took the porcelain off the plate, but that's okay. Like this, and then finally he gave up and went to the door and was standing there looking. And ultimately, before the evening was over, he was halfway up the steps to the gallery. And when the meeting was over and everybody left, he came up to me and said, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Certainly." And he said, "It's that virgin birth thing. I don't understand." And I said, "What don't you understand?" And he said, "Well, it's so absolutely beautiful, it has to be true whether it happened or not." That's orthonomy. That's orthonomy. That is a perfect emergence expression. Perfect emergence expression. And it rests on the truth of the narrative, not on the truth of the verse and the subverse. It is not a citation to chapter and verse. It's a citation to the lived story. And it's based on the belief that we are and become the story we tell ourselves, and that we are told by God. It is a direct blow on sola scriptura. It is also a direct blow on many emerging Christians who are not emergent. And here we get to the dichotomy. Because, and it's a real offense to Judaism, if we had a rabbi here, and they're people of the book, they're people of the story, but if we had a rabbi here, 9 times out of 10, he would interrupt me right now if I went on and didn't do it myself. He would interrupt and say, that's the Keatsian heresy. Based on John Keats' line, beauty is truth and truth is beauty. And can you really say that it's beautiful, knowing that the devil is more attractive, even in John Milton's Paradise Lost, that the devil is more attractive sometimes than is the angel of God? Is there not huge danger here? Well, of course there is. I said earlier, emergence is not the be-all and end-all. You know, it's got problems. It just happens to be. That's all. And we're not going to change the fact it is, but we can look at it honestly. This is the Keatsian heresy, if you are of that persuasion. I'm not sure I'm of that persuasion. I think there's more truth here than there is heresy. I really do. And I'm always surprised at Judaism's response to this. And so, what is emerging Christianity that's not emergent going to answer with? Well, it's going to go over here, and it's going to reinvent or resuscitate. Theonomy, yes. It's going to resuscitate from philosophy and from physical science, believe it or not, a word, theonomy, which is their way of saying the thing that's right is the thing that pleases God. And we're very close to a new form of sola scriptura. Very close. And it is the reason that Mark Driscoll, whom I seem to be quoting now, he's sort of the poster boy for the absolute end of emerging that's farthest from emergent. It's Pastor Driscoll. It's the basis on which he denies women any space in his pulpit. It's the basis on which he is deeply concerned about the gay issue and will not allow gays in, self-professing gays, for the foundationalism of him. So that all of these sympathies are there, but there is this tension, and this is the line of tension. You cannot talk about emergence Christianity as if it were a monolith. Don't make that mistake. The sensibilities inform that attitude, but it's not a monolith, and it's on this level of tension. This is the spectrum on which it works. All right. Having said that, I want to draw my quadrant one more time. And are you in real need of okay. Here is about 10%. Now, what I'm going to do is a real distortion. Okay, it's a real mathematical distortion of the thing. So I'm going to ask you to imagine, and it's pure imagination, that this right here is 50%. Okay, I'm doing it simply because that little dot is 50%. I'm doing that simply because I need the other space to write in. Okay, and that this is 10%, more or less. That leaves us 40% in between here. 40% of the whole of Christendom, 40% of each quadrant. And it's important to realize we're talking 50% of this quadrant is going to be up here, 10% is here, here's the 40%. Or of the whole thing. Either way you go at it. All right. Around this swirl, around this water spout of stuff coming out, there are concentric rings of about, right now, 10% each. They're supposed to go all the way down, okay? Up here, right against the reactionaries, if you want to call them that, that's an ugly word, but if you want to call them reactionaries, up here, they're the traditionalists. They probably really aren't 10%, but for purposes of argument, let's say that they are. Right below them is the Retraditionalist. And right below them is the Progressives. And right below them is the Hyphenateds. Don't worry, you never heard that word before. I know you didn't. I made it up. It's my contribution to the scholarship here, is I made up the word. And it was applicable for about 6 weeks before they all lost their hyphens, and now it's not applicable. It makes me so mad. Anyway, the traditionalists are those people, and if anything really obscures this discussion, it's having people say, oh, this emergence thing is just the younger generation, or the emergence thing is a generational problem. Because what that really means is the speaker is saying, we're going to get over it. That really annoys me. It's the same thing as that great, remember that great Carol Burnett joke that kids and their grandparents get along so well because they have a common enemy? Yeah, I love that one. I love that one. And it's the same. It's the same thing. It's the assumption that this is generational. I've gone now, I don't know how many cohort meetings. That is where you go into a city and the people from all the cell churches have come together under the oak tree to meet. And about half of them are as white-haired as I am. They may not be as old, but they're as white-haired. This is not a generational thing. Disabuse yourself of that. Now, having said that, it is also true that younger people are more adept at the computer. And the computer is a key to this. It works. It is a self-organizing thing because of the computer. And so there appears to be greater facility among the young. But the empathy, the sympathies, the resonances are across the generations. I will say, again, and it's narrative, I mean, it's qualitative rather than quantitative. It seems to me, number of learned professions in the white-haired parts of the cohorts. There are more lawyers and doctors and professors and school teachers and former clergy who have left the profession than there are just grocers or whatever. And that interests me also, that kind of skewing to the upper part of our trained professions seems to be present and informing that. So, but having said that, the traditionalists really are those people, and my heart kind of bleeds for them too sometimes. These are the folk in your parish who just honestly don't want it changed, who just don't want it changed. A few funerals is going to take care of it, and that's just the truth, because it is an age thing, by and large. But it's the guy who says, with great sincerity, my daddy paid for that organ, and by God, it's going to play when you bury me, you know? And he means it. He means it. It's not like the corners where it's a God vocation, where it's a real, I've got to aggressively go fight this thing because God told me. It's a, just don't mess with me. Just don't mess with me. I like it the way it is. I've done it this way all my life. Let me get out of here before you change it, kind of thing. I was talking to this dear young priest the other day, 3 weeks ago now, and he said something I'd never heard a priest say before. I can't remember where he was, Texas, I think, who said, what he said is, they drive me freaking crazy. They drive me freaking crazy, but I find myself asking one or two of them to lunch almost every week. And I said, why? And he said, because they always tell me something I didn't know. You know, something about the building, something about the history of the parish, something about the liturgy. He said every once in a while, and he was not a graduate from here, he's BTS, but he said, well, maybe that explains it. No. He said, you know, the things I didn't learn about the liturgy. And I can go back and look them up, and usually they're right. And he said, so I've got this tension and relationship here. But it is true. Funerals are probably going to take care. And I suspect that they're no more than about 5%, if they're that much right now. But they're there. The Retraditionalists are the people whom, this too is a neologism, and it's invented by Diana Butler Bass. And I hope all of you know Diana Butler Bass's work. If you don't, please, and there is a bibliography, I think, in your pack, but please make a note also in your notes to look at Diana Butler Bass's work. Practicing Christianity, Christianity for the Rest of Us. And let me sidebar right here and say that, having nothing to do with this, but with Diana, Diana has just released this month, February, this month, a book called The People's History of Christianity, which is it is the first attempt, I know, by a beautifully credentialed scholar to take church history and talk and just tell it. Just tell it like a story. And it's a wonderful book it will be a wonderful book for small group or for group study, because it's very accessible. It's just how it was, boys and girls. It's not theological. It's just the history of how we got from there to here. And it's because she is very gifted as a scholar. She's very gifted in being able to just talk to people. And she got a grant from the Lilly Foundation about 5 years ago now to study Christianity, to study parishes, to study what's going on. And one of the things she discovered was that one of the two areas of growth, and this is one of them, you'll be interested though, and this is the other. One of the two areas of growth is in the retraditionaling circle. And she invented the word to separate it from traditionalists and from progressives. And just as there is an age factor in the traditionalists, there is also an age factor here, and I'll bet every one of you has noticed it. The growth here is in young couples coming back to church with their children. That's always been a phenomenon of some, the old thing was you go to college, you quit going to church, you get married, you stay in bed, and then you have kids because you stayed in bed, and then you have to go to church again. And, I mean, it's just how the old joke used to be. This time, it's not that we are bringing the kids back for 6 or 8 years so we can get them indoctrinated in the general Christianized culture. That's not it at all. It is we are bringing them back because we want to be more Presbyterian than John Calvin was, or more Anglican than Hooker was, or more Baptist than Smith and Helwys were, or more Methodist than poor old John and Charles ever hoped to be. There was value in the story, and the story is going to be denominational, and we want it in every way celebrated. This is your folk who truly want the pageantry in our tradition as Episcopalians, who don't think that funny cone and that gold ring and that purple shirt and all of those skirts are in any way amusing. What they see is the glory of Queen Bess. It is the goriness of Henry VIII. It is the Elizabethan settlement. It is all those things that made us. So that this precious thing that we hold, these prayers we say, are sacramentalized and memorialized and relived in the reliving of the pageantry that we go through when we worship. It's that kind of re-embracing with real joy, with real depth. I don't care what kind of parish you're in. These people don't require a different church. They want you to clean up the one you got, They don't want a different building. They would just like one more stained glass window. They don't want to dance in your nave aisles. They would like 2 boxes instead of 1, Well, maybe. 1 anyway. 1 good one, okay? This is where a great deal of the energy is. It's true in Roman Catholicism, it's true in Methodism, it's true in Presbyterianism. Doesn't matter where you are, because each one of these quadrants has a circle. Now, I hope you will read Diana's work, or have her here maybe to Seabury to speak or something. I don't know. I hope you will be familiar with her. But whatever you do, and however you go at it, be aware, if it's easier, that 2 or 3 of the congregations she studied in practicing congregations and in Christianity for the rest of us were Anglican. St. Gregory's Holy Communion in Memphis, Tennessee, and St. Stephen's in Richmond were the 2 that she took. You might want to look. St. Stephen's, where the rector now is Gary Jones. St. Stephen's is a wonderful example of this. I have forgotten, and I don't want to exaggerate or lie. He's right at the verge of being a mega church. And there are not many megachurch. Megachurch will fit anywhere. Megachurch is a description or is a descriptor by size and membership. It is not a theological description. You can have megachurches that are Emergence and megachurches that are the most completely conservative ones in the world. It doesn't, but he's right at, and generally the break is above 5,000. And St. Stephen's in Richmond is right at that. Now, you know, the whole notion of, and it has grown from about 1700, I think, when he went there 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I guess it is. I hope I'm right. I'm fudging some factors maybe. But that, so that it has grown that. Why? Because he's a retraditioning priest. One of the reasons that Holy Communion also showed up in Butler Bass's original work in Memphis was Gary Jones was there. And he built it as a retraditionaling congregation or parish before he came here and did this thing. This is not an ode to Gary Jones, by the way. He happens to be a friend, but this is based on Butler Bass's work. How does he do it? Well, he does a Celtic Mass once a week. Well, he does evensong. Now, there's an impractical thing to do, right? You know, you're going to do evensong every night? You got to be kidding, Father. But people will come, you know. He absolutely, every linen that can be there is there. Every piece of garb that was ever invented will be hanging on somebody's body in procession every Sunday, you know. And you don't want to be part of his altar guild. It will drive you freaking crazy. You know, his sacristy is bigger than this room because it takes it. But that's what's happening. And why are they coming? And you stand in his nave and you look. And it's not his nave, obviously. He was called by St. Stephen's because they also were of the same persuasion. So, you know, let's be honest. But what we've got here is a group of people, is a parish, is a vestry and a priest and an enabling bishop who are absolutely recreating the wonder of the tradition and saying to their people, come and let us form each other within the beauty of this thing. They are not that far from orthonomy. They really aren't. And it will work. I don't care. And because you don't have to lose your building, you just have to fix it up. And because you don't have to lose your vestments, you just have to add to them. It will work. The problem is, and I've been fascinated by this and visiting Anglican communions around the country, or Episcopal communions around the country, been interested in the fact that how the first struggle is toward that evensong. And it's hard to get people. You usually have to commandeer your vestry, and you vestries who are here right now don't want to hear this, but you used to have to commandeer your vestry to come lead it. And it usually apparently works better if you do it on Friday night or something. And you do it by yourself, essentially. There'll be nobody there at first. And it'll take a while. If you're smart, you'll announce it on the net. And you will pass out an announcement by email that it's there. And then you'll get 2 or 3. And the first thing you know, you'll get 30 or 40 folk, most of whom will not be Episcopalian. Most of whom will be emergent. That's the other interesting and funny thing about it. Now, you may make some converts out of it, but they'll be there. The other thing that's happening up here, it's also happening all over the center here. And it was first called to my attention by some New England dioceses, and I hadn't realized it. Now I'm hearing it all over the country, is confession. The old business of confession is very much a part of this, as it's a part of this. The desire to confess to a priest or to an ordained person. And I said when I was here with the Diocese of Chicago that you'd be smart to, on your home page, put a place for the priest. The priest is in, or something, a tile like that, that allows folk to come in and begin a conversation, a confessional conversation with the priest. The church has not yet decided whether you can absolve on the net, and that sounds silly. Yeah, it's a chuckle, isn't it? It's a chuckle, except it is canon law that we're going to have to figure out. Can you indeed, can you do that? In the same way, does your impunity, does clerical privilege accrue when somebody comes in on the net and says, I killed my mother 3 years ago and nobody caught me? Well, what do you do with that? you're out right now, obviously, is the fact that it's probably an avatar talking to your avatar, and we're not really having a conversation. And you've got no way of knowing how to get at X. That kind of silliness won't last long. We're going to have to deal with canon law in terms of the internet. And those are real, genuine issues. But they also, my priest friends say, that usually if you get a serious confession, one who may just be confessing that he stole something or confessing that he's not prayerful as he should be or whatever. If you get that kind of confession, usually on a home page for a parish where the priest is the tile, you're dealing with people who are local, who are near enough so that you can eventually in the second or third encounter say, well, why don't you meet me at Starbucks? I'd like to talk to you about this in person. And at that point, old canon law ships in, and you're okay. And you also are dealing with a human being. It is the anonymity of the net, however, that is enabling confession. And it is right here. Now, having said that, as I say, I did a big deal with it, and some of you heard me, when I was here speaking to the clergy of the diocese a couple or 3 months ago. And I was met yesterday or the day before by one of your priests who said, I want you to see my tile. And he pulled out his laptop and showed it to me, and he said, nobody since November has come. Are you sure you know what you're talking about? Mea culpa, Padre. I don't know why they're not doing it. I suggested it was because the tile was about this big, and you really had to care in order to see it. But it is true that that this is bringing back some of those former sacraments and that kind of thing. All right, I want to lift this up just a minute and go. I'm coming right back to it. But yesterday, when we were initiating this conversation, I said that there is a central question always, or sometimes it's our authority, that informs every single one of these. Every time we go through one of these upheavals, every time we go through one of the greats, this is always the primary question. There are either one or two, and in our case 3, in the case of the Great Emergence, questions below that. They are not less important, they're just not as consistently present. One of these, as I said yesterday, is what is the nature of humanness? What is a human being? The second one that's very much in our face is the need for a theology of religion. Where or what is our theology of religion? Well, I can't spell religion. That's a disaster in my profession. Which is to say, put simplistically, what it means is, how can I, as a devout Christian, live in a polity composed of members of other faiths that are entirely antithetical to mine and not create strife? How can I share space with those who follow a different God or a different way of getting at God? And if I'm evangelical, how can I do that when my God also says that I have an obligation to evangelize my neighbor? And yet, if I do, I create civil strife. I create hard feelings. I interrupt a relationship. How do I get around that contradiction? And the third one, which we will come back to, is the nature of the atonement or of the substitutionary death, or however you want to put it, and Anselm of Canterbury's notion of what the crucifixion was all about. It probably shouldn't have happened. It is this one right here. It is the theology of religion that makes it difficult for me to do a good job about the progressives. And so this is by way of apology. This is to say that the progressives are those who are slightly nearer to the center. They are not necessarily forced to retraditionalize. They usually have the drop-down screen. They usually have in their naves or their sanctuaries or whatever you want to call it, people doing liturgical dance even as the preacher drags on. They will occasionally have artists potting over in the corner because emergence Christianity is deeply incarnational, because emergence Christianity wants to feel. And the nearer you get to the center, the more potter's wheels you're going to find in holy space, the more artists you're going to find drawing on the wall, the more people you're going to find who suddenly get up from the pew and go to the back and begin to animate this way or to reenact the sermon or their experience of what the sermon has been about or the conversation has been about. If you find that disconcerting, welcome to the world of the traditionalist who really doesn't want to see it happen, not in his or her name. But the progressives are incarnational in that sense. They are in every way emergent, except they're not quite there. They still hold on to a few things. And the reason they're called progressives is they are the congregations, they are the circle that are dealing with some of the heavy lifting theologically. These are the folk, and by and large, again, if you can generalize, these are the folk who are heavily trained in theology as you and I understand it. They are not sola scriptura. God knows they are a long way from sola scriptura, but they know what they're, as a rule, and I'm generalizing about hundreds and thousands of people, I understand that, but if you can generalize, then here's where there's some heavy lifting going on. Their leader, their Brian McLaurin, is a man named Eric Elnes, E-L-N-E-S. He wrote a book called The Phoenix Affirmation, which is also in your bibliography. It's about that thick, and it's about that size in trim. You can read it in 10 minutes, and it'll take you 10 years to understand what he just told you. Not because it's opaque in any way, it's very clear, but because the significance and the depth of what he just told you, it's their 95 Theses as a movement. He is pastor of a megachurch, countryside, is 17,000, I think, and growing now in Arizona. A dear friend, and he understands that I don't present well. Their major theologian is probably Hal Tussig, T-U-S-S-I-G, that I stumble here, and I wish I didn't. I wish I could do it better. But whatever else they are all-inclusive. The Emergence will say they're all-inclusive too. They don't have the struggle with what that means. The progressives, yes. No. It's pretty good and pretty readable. I need to do that. Delwyn Brown, what does a progressive believe? I will. Why didn't Eric tell me that? There are shades there. This is the most shaded of the circles, bless you. Delwyn Brown, what does a progressive believe? It's important to understand what this circle does, because in many ways it mediates. It really is the mediating circle. Okay, is his training. When they say they're all-inclusive, thank you. The hyphenateds will say the Emergence will say they're all-inclusive, but they don't have any problem with it. This is where it's being wrestled with. This is where the actual, this is to say Christian particularity, Christian exclusivity, or exclusiveness cannot happen. There is no justification for saying that there's only one way to God, and that is through Jesus Christ. Now, when you say that as an emergence, that's okay, probably. When you say it as a progressive, you say, oh, but it's also written, unless you eat of this flesh and drink of this blood, you cannot see the kingdom of God. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Scripture after scripture that creates that tension. Now, they're all-inclusive in gender as well and in gender roles, and that's no problem. That doesn't seem to be, it's primarily the theology of religion, where we owe them, every Christian in this country owes the progressive movement and its thinkers a real vote of thanks, because they really are doing the heavy lifting. I can't get there. The reason I stumble is that I'm just not an ecumenist or an interfaith person or whatever. It's just not in me. I believe unless you eat of this flesh and drink of this blood, you cannot see the kingdom of God. At the same time, I'm not arrogant enough to think that Jesus Christ has to look like a Nazarene, that Jesus Christ could have appeared in other places and in other particular cultural adaptations. But that's a rhetorical fix. Any way you go at it, that's a rhetorical fix. I still think it's Jesus. I'm still Jesus only. But anyway, this is what they do. Are they growing? Yes, they're active. I don't know if they're growing so much as they are vigorous. They are in good health. And about 10% of us. Now we get to the hyphenates, which is where I wanted to get before lunch. Yeah, I'll make it. The hyphenates I call hyphenates simply because up until I've named them, they were spelling themselves as Anglo, A-N-G-L-O hyphen, Mergent, M-E-R-G-E-N-T, or Presbo, P-R-E-S-B-Y, Presby, hyphen, M-E-R-G-E-N-T-S, or Metho, which sounds like a bad drug, but M-E-T-H-O, M-E-R, with a hyphen in it. The minute I finally started calling them hyphenated, they dropped the hyphens, every single one of them. It just annoys me to death because I was laying my mark right here. I was going to be remembered for having... And the funny thing is, then they started calling themselves hybrids and decided they didn't like it, so now they're back to calling themselves hyphenated, even though the hyphen is gone now, and it makes no sense at all when you see them call that. They are those, and they are probably... they're probably more Anglo-Emergents than any of the others. There's a sense of humor in these folk. The Pentecostal renewalist folk were for a long, long time calling themselves, AG Emergence, if you were Assemblies of God, or they were calling themselves Cogemergence or whatever. And now they have all got together and decided, fairly recently, in the last 2 or 3 months, they're going to be Submergents, which I just think is a hoot, just a hoot. I love it. There is huge playfulness. That's the other thing about emergence that gives routine traditionalists fits, is that they think God's funny as all get out. And not in a disrespectful way. It's just if you can't have fun with your faith, why are you dragging it around? You know, have fun with it. And so the other one I love is that some of the ladies across all of these spectrums who are basically emergent and are emergence Christians and want to get together and are priests or pastors in their respective areas, rather than joining their denominational hyphenated, are now calling themselves the convergents. And so convergents are ladies in the clergy who don't want to stay natally but want to be gender-oriented in there. But anyway, so there's a certain playfulness in all of this. What you've got is folk who are, let's take the Presbymergents, who are absolutely not about to leave the theology of Calvin or the principles of the Westminster Confession of Faith. They're not. They absolutely believe that. But they have all of the sympathies and the understandings of emergence Christianity. They want self-organizing organizations and institutions and congregations within Calvinist tradition. They want the drop-down screen. They want the dancing in their aisles. They don't want the pulpit. They do want, chairs that are sitting around so that we can do whatever we want to do. They are absolutely emergents in every way, except they're not willing to leave the Calvinist principles. They're not willing to leave the doctrine. They, for some reason, and I've not ever understood, the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America was quicker to understand what was happening with its hyphenateds than any other denomination in this country. Right from the get-go, Louisville, their central headquarters, their church headquarters, Louisville has been aware of the Presbymergents and of what they can mean to the church. And they have poured money and respect, and the respect is important, and encouragement into their Presbymergents more than any other group has done. And as a result, the Presbymergents also call themselves loyal radicals. And I think that's a really good term. That's their other name for themselves. And if you Google loyal radicals, you'll get Presbymergents. Their leaders are people like Troy Bronsink or Adam Walker Cleveland or Karen Sloan. They are meeting even as we speak. No, they met up through yesterday, I guess, in Louisville for the first time. Louisville had all of them come at the church's expense into the church headquarters to sit down and begin to talk about what it was they needed and what it was that the church, the institutional church, could give them. Now, there is a man named Ray Anderson who is now emeritus at Fuller Seminary. He just became emeritus. He just retired. Who I think says more about this than anybody else I know. And his metaphor, his book is Emerging Theology for an Emergent Church, or Emergent Theology for an Emerging Church. Anyway, it's in your bibliography. His thesis is that we are indeed reenacting the first century in more ways than we realize, not the least of which is that we have to remember that there was the church in Jerusalem and the church in Antioch, and that much of the tension of the first century was between those two bodies. And the church in Jerusalem, which was obviously inherited church, and he's right, Professor Anderson's right, this is inherited church. Antioch is fresh expressions of church. And Antioch kept coming back to Jerusalem, asking for the imprimatur, asking for some kind of respect, asking for continuity, not asking for money, but asking for those intangibles that gave legitimacy to what it was doing. But as it came back this way, it unfortunately brought with it things like circumcision. Big deal until you call it homosexuality in the 21st century. It came bringing questions of meat sold in the shambles, could it be eaten? It came bringing questions of priests, rabbis who wanted to convert to Christianity, could they be? All of the tensions of the first century were there. Did Jerusalem, by engaging Antioch, get any better off? No. Jerusalem was going to, and Antioch was going to. And Rowan Williams, and I'm told Bishop Catherine also has said the same. Rowan Williams says at this juncture, every time he's talking about it, if we think that we are here to save the Episcopal Church instead of to serve the kingdom of God, may God help us. And he's absolutely right. He is absolutely right. And so is she. And so, the Presbyterian, which is to say, and for what it's worth, when things got tough in Jerusalem, if you will remember, Antioch took up a purse and sent some money home. But don't count on it. You know, it may not happen this go-round, but it did then. So God is doing a new thing. The Presbymergents are the ones who are most visible right now in many ways. Numerically, I suspect they're more Anglomergents. I'm sure that there is probably more energy now in Anglomergents. And Bishop Catherine is deeply aware of this, as Rowan Williams has been for a number of years, which is to say that this year, just about 7 months ago, she appointed 2 new members, full-time members, to the church staff at 8:15. One is Tom Brackett, and one is Tom Martin. Gary Martin, I'm sorry. And they are there specifically to begin to engage our Anglomergents. They are there to talk about church planting and church extension and what you do as Anglomergents begin to become a real force within American Christianity, carrying with them not a denominational tradition, but a tradition within mainstream Christianity, the Anglican tradition. There is an Anglomergent steering committee. We meet with a number of bishops in attendance. There will be a real presence at GC for those of you for the first time, for those of you who want to see what it looks like. If you want to see what an Anglomergent, who they are, or at least who some of them are, you can go to anglomergent.ning.com. anglomergent.ning.com. And you will see, you can join the conversation there. I think they'd be happy to have you. I'm pleased to say that when that site went up, I never wanted to be a priest. God help me, can't imagine being a priest. But when that website went up, I was surprised to discover that I was canon to the ordinary. when there was no ordinary there, and wrote some of them and said, what does this mean? And the answer came back, well, who knows what a canon to the ordinary does anyway? They generally carry out the trash, and so we think you should carry out the spam. And I thought, okay, all right. It took me a long time to realize I was even an Anglo-emergent, because when you're watching something, you don't identify with it. I always thought I was a stick-in-the-mud Anglican traditionalist, but I suppose I probably am Anglo-emergent. Anyway, there they are. The steering committee will meet next at St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco in about 3 weeks, and then we will meet back here in Chicago as guests of Jeff Lee. And if you want to see what an emergence bishop looks like, go to YouTube and look at your bishop. Yes, exactly. There were ripples all over the internet when Jeff Lee, new bishop of Chicago, had the wisdom to go on YouTube and talk about the Episcopal Church. That's what emergence looks like, or what at least Anglo-emergence looks like. And having said that, one last thing before we go to prayers. Having said St. Gregory of Nyssa, I think it helps greatly if you see what the examples of it are instead of having me talk forever. St. Gregory of Nyssa was probably one of the first of the Anglo-emergent churches. It didn't even lay claim to it. Do you know of what I'm speaking? Do you know St. Gregory of Nyssa? All right. It now, as you know, it's 30 years old. About 2.5 years ago, its founding pastors withdrew. That is, Donald Schell is a dear friend, and he and Rick both said, it is time now for this parish to have a new vision. And so they together retired from the pastorate and gave it back, if you will, to the congregation there. It is emergent in that if you go in, you think you're almost in an Orthodox, a Greek Orthodox church, filled with icons, filled with all of the glory of the tradition. The doors are wide open, literally to the streets. They are not in the fanciest part of San Francisco. In fact, they're in the Rust Belt. And most emergence Christians will choose to habitat within the Rust Belt. They were so outside the box that they were not allowed to be an Episcopal church under diocesan control until, I think Donald told me, 7 years ago, when they were finally admitted to the diocese as a standing Episcopal church. They sit in sort of in choir. That is to say, the chairs all move around, but they look at each other like this. To preach there is one of the most disconcerting experiences I've ever had. You sit in an easy chair, and you sit right on the what might be a chancel, sort of, maybe, in an easy chair, and you look out, and after you've said your piece, then they begin to tell you what was wrong with what you just said. It's a very humbling experience, to say the least. And they will. They will tell you immediately. They are totally open in every way to everything, including the fact that, and I think I conflated it, and it's such a wonderful story, I don't want to inflate it and thereby denigrate it. Sarah Miles, whom you may know, Sarah Miles has just been elected their assistant rector. She's a Jew and was an atheist. Who has the most dramatic conversion story I ever heard, which is to say that she was in that bad neighborhood of San Francisco one day, saw the wide open doors, and they are wide open. You're a dog and want to do your business, come on in. Nothing's going to stop you, you know. And she saw them and went in, and there was, she said it was such a strange-looking building that she, out of curiosity, she's a reporter by profession, or was, went in. And she said, they're having a service, and not knowing what to do, I just went and did what everybody else did and knew nothing about Christianity. Good Jew, knew nothing about Christianity. And she said, so I opened my mouth, which was what everybody else was doing, and he put that thing in my mouth. And she said, oh my God. So I can't tell her story. I shouldn't try. She tells it better than I do because she doesn't crack up. She said, I didn't understand what tasting Christ was. And she said, I couldn't even get up from the rail. And I didn't go in there because I was in religious need. I went in there because I was a reporter and curious about that building. And she said, the minute that hit my tongue, I was converted right there. She said, I couldn't even take the wine. I just sat there until they helped me away. She's now assistant rector there. She also oversees the food pantry, which is a big part of their mission and a big part of the reason that they are located where they are. And what I don't want to conflate is, I think she told me it's 9 tons of food that move through there every week. It's either 9 tons or 900,000 or 9,000 pounds. I think it's 9 tons of food that they move through every week. And it is served in what is the same area where they have the Mass. The altar is stripped and it becomes the distribution table. And you come in and you get your food and your box right there. And there is no question. Nothing is holy here except our humanity before God and the way we sacramentalize it. So that's one to look at. They are now, frankly, they're hosting the next meeting of the steering committee. They are now, frankly, saying we're emergent, we're Anglo-emergent, and always have been. The other one that's kind of the poster child is the Church of the Apostles in Seattle, where a woman named Karen Ward is abbess. She is not rector, though she's canonically resident with Greg Rickles in the Diocese of Olympia, and she's very much an Episcopal priest. Don't mess with her. She came up out of Lutheranism, and she knows why she's an Episcopal, thank you very much, and will tell you in a heartbeat, so don't ask unless you've got a lot of time to listen. But she's not a rector. She's an abbess, because attached to the Church of the Apostles is Fremont Abbey. One of the things about emergence, one of the characteristics is a heavy dose of neo-monasticism. And the Church of the Apostles enacts that, where you've got an abbess running something like an abbey with a whole sliding spectrum of the degree of commitment, whether it's just commitment to each other in prayer, or whether it goes all the way over to common purse and common table, living in community, or for some of her people, and there are 20,000 at least neo-monastic emergent communities in this country now that have been documented. Or whether you go all the way over to common purse, common table, vows of obediency and constancy. Those that are that extreme, you wouldn't know that they are, but those that are that extreme usually take 15% of their individual incomes and live on that as a community and spend the other 85% of combined incomes on works usually in their neighborhood, missional work. So that what we've got here in emergence Christianity, like all knives, cuts 2 ways. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it's got some very, very good things going for it. And some wonderful things that we have lost. And so, prayer. I almost made it. I'm sorry. 5 minutes too long, but that's okay.